The Golden Throne's heartbeat stopped for 6 seconds last Thursday. 6 seconds of absolute silence in the chamber, where 10,000 psychers burn every day to keep a corpse god functioning. 6 seconds where every navigator in the segmentum solar felt their third eye boil in its socket. 6 seconds where the Astronomican went dark and 300 ships currently in the warp simply ceased to exist. When the heartbeat resumed, it was different. Slower, weaker, wrong. The Adeptus Custodes killed everyone who witnessed it. Servitors, scribes, even the tech priests monitoring the systems, all received the Emperor's mercy in the form of bolter shells through their skulls. The blood is still being scrubbed from the marble floors 3 levels down from the throne itself. But you can't kill what people felt across half a segmentum. You can't lobotomize the terror that gripped every human psyker when they felt the Emperor's presence flicker like a candle in a storm. I was there. Not in the throne chamber itself. Nobody gets that close except the 10,000. But close enough. Close enough to hear the machine scream of systems that haven't failed in 10 millennia, suddenly redlining. Close enough to smell the particular stench of psyker flesh when it burns wrong. When something interrupts the process and the souls being fed into the golden furnace try to escape back into their bodies. They don't make it. They never make it. But for 6 seconds, they tried. And the sounds they made weren't human anymore. The fabricator general arrived within the hour. Uudia Raskian himself, a being more metal than flesh, more machine than man. His entourage of tech priests swarmed the throne like scavengers on a corpse, their mechadendrites probing systems that predate the Imperium itself. I watched him work from the observation gallery, watched him interface directly with machines that would fry a normal human's brain in microseconds. When he finally disconnected, pulling the data cables from the ports in his skull with small spurts of machine oil and cerebral fluid, his face was expressionless, but his hands were shaking. A being who had replaced his hands with precision manipulator units 3,000 years ago. Hands that could perform microsurgery on atomic-scale components without trembling, and they were shaking. He spoke 1 sentence before teleporting back to Mars. 5 words in binaric cant that my augmetic ear caught and translated before I could stop it. The cascade has finally begun. That was 8 days ago. Since then, sectors across the Imperium have started going dark. Not the sudden darkness of invasion or the slow fade of worlds falling to corruption. This is different. This is systematic. The Astronomican flickers in patterns that suggest not malfunction, but something worse, something deliberate, as if whatever burns inside that golden prison on Terra is trying to send a message, and the only language it has left is the dimming of humanity's light. Roboute Guilliman hasn't slept since he received the report. I know because I'm assigned to his Victrix Guard, one of the gene-forged warriors who stand between the avenging sun and anything that might want him dead. I've watched him pace the strategium aboard the Macraga's Honor for 7 days straight, his Primarch physiology sustaining him where any normal human would have collapsed. He's not studying tactical displays or reviewing fleet dispositions. He's staring at a single data slate, reading the same document over and over, and I've never seen such naked fear on a Primarch's face. Once, about 4 days in, I saw what was on that slate, just a glimpse. Just enough to read the header before Guilliman noticed my gaze and locked the screen. It was a document from the Emperor himself, written in the Primarch's own private cipher, the one only he and his gene father shared. The date stamp said it was encoded during the Great Crusade more than 10,000 years ago. The title made my enhanced metabolism skip several beats. When I can no longer hold the gate, final instructions. Guilliman hasn't shared those instructions with anyone, not the High Lords. Not his fellow Primarchs, what few remain, not even the Adeptus Custodes. Whatever the Emperor wrote in that document, whatever contingencies he prepared for the moment when his vigil finally ends, Guilliman bears that knowledge alone, and it's breaking him. I've served for 2 centuries. I've stood in the throne rooms of chapter masters and walked the decks of ships lost in the warp for years at a time. I've seen things that would send normal humans screaming into madness, sights that required psychic conditioning to even process. But watching a Primarch, a being crafted by the Emperor's own hands to be humanity's champion and protector, reduced to this state of barely controlled terror, that's something new. That's something that makes the old fear creep up from my gut and into my throat. Because if Guilliman is afraid, then we should all be terrified. The Imperium is dying. That's not heresy. It's not defeatism. It's not the kind of statement that normally earns you a bolter round from the nearest commissar. It's just fact. The kind of fact that everyone knows, but nobody says, because speaking it aloud makes it more real somehow. Terra itself is a monument to decay. 18 billion souls packed onto a world that should hold a fraction of that number. Its oceans boiled away millennia ago and replaced with processing plants that turn the dead into food for the living. The air tastes like copper and promethium. The sun is a dim orange smear through atmospheric pollution, so thick it hasn't rained naturally in 7,000 years. I was born in the underhive of Hive Tertius, one of 300 such hives that covered Terra's surface like tumors on diseased flesh. Down there, 10 kilometers below the spires, where nobles breathe filtered air and drink water that doesn't taste of industrial runoff. Down where the only light comes from flickering lumen strips and the only law is whatever the local gang lord decides. That's where most of Terra's population actually lives. That's where I learned what the Imperium really is, stripped of propaganda and prayer. It's meat. Human meat ground up and processed through a machine that cares nothing for the individual components, only the final output. My father worked in a manufactorum producing lasgun power packs, standing at an assembly line for 16-hour shifts until his back bent permanently and his hands locked into claws from repetitive motion. My mother cleaned corpses in a mortuary, preparing the dead for their final contribution to the Imperium, rendered down into protein paste that would feed workers in other sectors. My older brother was taken by the black ships when the Inquisition sweep found him hiding his psychic abilities. We never saw him again. The official notification said he'd been given to the Emperor's service. We knew what that meant. The Golden Throne eats psychers, 10,000 every single day, a number so vast it loses meaning until you try to picture it. 10,000 human beings with families and dreams and fears, all fed into a machine that burns their souls like promethium to keep one man, if you can still call him that, barely alive. The black ships travel endlessly across the Imperium, harvesting psychers from every world. Because the moment the supply stops, the moment that daily sacrifice is interrupted, everything ends. I escaped that fate by being selected for the Astra Militarum. When the tithe collectors came through our sector looking for recruits, I volunteered immediately. Anything was better than waiting for the psychic awakening that had taken my brother, or the slow death of factory work that was killing my father piece by piece. The selection process was brutal. They took 5,000 of us from Hive Tertius. By the end of training, fewer than 300 remained. The rest died in ways designed to test every aspect of our capability. Live fire exercises with actual casualties, forced marches through zones deliberately contaminated with chemical weapons, hand-to-hand combat where the losers were executed on the spot to maintain fighting spirit in the winners. I survived because I was good at killing. Simple as that. I could put a lasgun round through a target's eye at 300 meters. I could field strip and reassemble my weapon in total darkness in under 20 seconds. I could march for days without sleep, fight when my body was screaming for rest, and follow orders even when those orders meant certain death for the soldiers under my command. The Imperium doesn't need philosophers or artists or dreamers. It needs killers, and I excelled. My first deployment was to Armageddon, the third war for that ash-waste hell, where Gazkul Thraka's orc hordes crashed against Imperial defenses in numbers that defied comprehension. I was 19 years old, fresh from training, and I thought I understood war. I thought the simulations and training exercises had prepared me for the reality of combat. I was wrong in ways that still wake me up screaming 30 years later. The orcs came at us in a green tide that stretched from horizon to horizon. Literally millions of them, from the smallest Gretchen to Knobs, in mega armor that shrugged off Lascanon fire. They came howling their brutal war cries, firing weapons cobbled together from scrap that shouldn't work by any law of physics, but did anyway, because orcs believe they will. And we stood there, 247 men and women of the 217th Terran Regiment, and we fired into that tide until our lasguns overheated and our fingers blistered on the triggers. The first wave broke against our position, like water on rock. We held. The second wave came harder, with orc bikes and trucks loaded with shooter boys who laid down suppressing fire while their fellows charged. We held, but barely. The third wave included a battle wagon, a mobile fortress bristling with guns, and our heavy weapons teams died trying to stop it. By the fourth wave, we'd run out of ammunition for everything except our lasguns, and those were starting to fail from overuse. That's when I learned what the Imperium really expects from its soldiers. Our commissar, a man named Vulcan, whose face I can still see when I close my eyes, walked down the trench line as the fourth wave approached. He wasn't giving inspirational speeches or promising the Emperor's protection. He was checking ammunition counts and marking soldiers who were out or nearly out. When he finished his count, he drew his bolt pistol and started executing every third man. The reasoning was simple and horrifying. We didn't have enough ammunition to hold the line with our current numbers. But with fewer defenders, the remaining ammunition would last longer. So he shot 30 men in the head, right there in front of their comrades, and then ordered the survivors to hold position. We held, not because we were brave or faithful or inspired. We held because we understood that retreat meant a bolt round from Vulcan, and at least the orcs gave us a chance to die fighting. I survived Armageddon. Most didn't. Of the 247 soldiers in my regiment who landed on that ash waste, 18 walked off again when the deployment ended 3 years later. 18. The rest died to orc blades, or orc bullets, or commissar's justice, or simple exhaustion. Some went mad from the constant combat and had to be restrained and eventually shot when they started attacking their own side. Others just gave up, put their lasguns under their chins, and pulled the trigger because death was preferable to another day of war. But we held Armageddon. The hives didn't fall. The manufactorums kept producing. The Imperium maintained its grip on a world whose strategic value is measured in billions of rounds of ammunition and millions of tons of processed ore. That's victory in the 41st millennium. Not glory, not honor. Just the grim satisfaction of still being alive when your enemies are dead, and the knowledge that tomorrow you'll do it all over again. After Armageddon, I was noticed, not for heroism. The Imperium has enough heroes, and most of them are dead. I was noticed for survival, for being the kind of soldier who could be thrown into hell repeatedly and keep crawling out the other side. They tested me, put me through trials that made basic training look like a holiday. Psychological conditioning to resist chaos, corruption, surgical enhancements to improve reaction time and pain tolerance, training in weapons and tactics that aren't taught to regular guard because the mortality rate during training alone is unacceptable. Eventually, I was recruited into the Tempestus Scions, the elite of the Astra Militarum. We're the ones they send when normal guard isn't enough, when a mission requires precision and skill rather than just bodies to throw at the enemy. The selection process had a 90% fatality rate. I watched dozens of candidates die during training, their bodies carried out in sealed bags while the rest of us kept drilling. But I made it through, earned my hot-shot lasgun and carapace armor, and joined a unit that operated across multiple sectors executing missions nobody else could handle. For 10 years, I fought as a scion. We dropped onto demon worlds to retrieve Archaeotech the Mechanicus wanted. We infiltrated orc-held space hulks to plant virus bombs in their reactor cores. We assassinated rogue planetary governors whose corruption threatened entire subsectors. Every mission was suicide odds, and every mission we somehow survived, though usually with casualties that would devastate normal units. Then came the mission that changed everything. We were deployed to a world called Nemesis Tessera, a forge world on the edge of the Segmentum Solar that had gone dark 3 months earlier. No communications, no tithes, nothing. The Mechanicus suspected heresy. The Inquisition suspected chaos. We were sent to investigate and, if necessary, mark the world for exterminatus. What we found was worse than heresy. The Forge world's population was still there, still working the manufactorums, still following their daily routines. But they weren't human anymore, not entirely. Something had changed them, altered them at a fundamental level that made my skin crawl just looking at them. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated. Their eyes tracked in unison when we entered their spaces. And when we tried to question them, they all spoke the same words at the same time in perfect synchronization. The Omnissiah stirs, the machine awakens. Flesh is weak. Flesh must be upgraded. We tried to extract information, tried to find out what had happened, but it was useless. The entire population had been transformed into a hive mind of sorts, a collective consciousness that wore human bodies like ill-fitting clothes. My commanding officer made the decision to call for exterminatus immediately. We barely made it off-world before the cyclonic torpedoes turned Nemesis Tessera into a lifeless rock. But I'd seen something during our extraction. In the main Forge temple, where the tech priests conducted their rituals of the Omnissiah, there was a statue, not unusual in itself. Forge worlds are covered in devotional iconography. But this statue was of the Emperor, and it was wrong. The proportions were off, the details twisted, and most disturbing of all, it was moving. Slowly, imperceptibly, but definitely moving. Growing. Changing. I reported this in my after-action briefing. 24 hours later, I was summoned to an inquisitorial facility on Terra and questioned for 6 days straight. They wanted to know every detail, every observation, every feeling I'd had in that temple. When they were finished, an inquisitor whose name I never learned told me I had 2 options. I could undergo mind-wiping and return to regular service with no memory of Nemesis Tessera, or I could be assigned to a specialized unit tracking similar incidents across the Imperium. I chose the second option, not because I was brave, but because I'd already seen too much to just forget. The mind-wiping process isn't gentle. It strips memories, yes, but it takes pieces of personality and identity with them. Soldiers who undergo it come back wrong, functional but hollow. I'd rather keep my nightmares than lose whatever made me human. That was 20 years ago. Since then, I've traveled across Imperial space investigating incidents that don't fit normal patterns of chaos corruption or Xenos infiltration. Worlds where populations develop psychic abilities overnight. Ships that return from the warp with crews that have aged centuries despite objective time, elapsed being mere weeks. Phenomena that suggest reality itself is becoming unstable. That the barriers between materium and immaterium are degrading faster than anyone wants to admit. And everywhere I go, I hear the same whispers. The Emperor is changing. The Golden Throne is failing. Something is coming, something vast and terrible and inevitable. And humanity is utterly unprepared for it. 3 months ago, I was assigned to Guilliman's Victrix Guard. Not for combat prowess. I'm good, but there are thousands better. I was assigned because of what I know, what I've seen. The Avenging Sun is gathering people with specialized knowledge, building a network of individuals who understand that the Imperium faces threats that can't be shot or stabbed or burned. Threats that exist in the gaps between what's known and what's forbidden to know. That's how I ended up standing guard in the Strategium when the report about the Golden Throne's heartbeat arrived. That's how I witnessed Guilliman's fear, saw a demigod confronted with evidence that his father's long vigil might finally be ending. And that's why I'm recording this now, speaking into a data slate that I'll hide somewhere in the Macragus Honors archives, where maybe, someday, someone will find it and understand. Because I think we're living through humanity's last days. Not the last days of the Imperium, which has been dying for millennia, but the last days of humanity as a coherent species. Whatever comes next, whether it's extinction or transformation or something we don't have words for yet, it won't be human, not in any way that matters. The evidence is everywhere, once you know how to look. The mutation rates on core worlds have increased by 37% in the last decade. Psyker births are up by 42% across all tithes. The warp itself is bleeding into real space with increasing frequency, manifesting phenomena that used to require specific rituals or massive chaos invasions. Reality is coming apart at the seams, and the only thing holding it together is a corpse on a golden throne who might not be able to hold much longer. I've read the restricted reports from the Adeptus Astronomica, the ones that detail what happens to navigators when they try to pierce the warp in regions where the Astronomican is weak. Their third eyes don't just blind them, they change them, transform them into something that screams in colors that shouldn't exist, and speaks in languages that cause hemorrhaging in anyone who listens. The Navis Nobilitae is executing its own members at unprecedented rates, killing navigators who return from long voyages, changed in ways that threaten everyone around them. The Space Marines are noticing too, though few will speak openly about it. The black rage among the Blood Angels is increasing in frequency and intensity. The Wolfen Curse is manifesting in Space Wolves chapters that had thought themselves immune. Even the Ultramarines, the most stable and codex-compliant of all chapters, report incidents of brothers experiencing visions and episodes that suggest the Genocide itself is becoming unstable. Belisarius Call's Primaris Marines were supposed to fix this. Bigger, stronger, more stable genetic templates that would create a new generation of transhuman warriors free from the flaws of their predecessors. And in some ways, they've succeeded. Primaris Marines are formidable, exactly as advertised. But there are problems that Cole doesn't publicize. Problems with integration, with compatibility, with psychological stability. I've spoken with Primaris Marines who describe feeling disconnected from humanity in ways that trouble them deeply. They're stronger than their firstborn brothers, yes, but that strength comes with a coldness that wasn't there before. They don't feel fear the way they should. They don't feel compassion the way the Codex Astartes demands. They're becoming weapons, perfect and terrible, but weapons nonetheless. Tools rather than warriors. And that distinction matters more than Call seems to understand. And then there's the Rubicon Primaris, the procedure that upgrades firstborn Marines into Primaris. The success rate is classified, but I've heard whispers, 70%, maybe less. 3 out of every 10 Space Marines who undergo the procedure die, their bodies rejecting the new organs, their genus seed rebelling against the modifications. And of those who survive, how many are truly the same warriors they were before? How many come out of that process with pieces of themselves missing, carved away by biological necessity? The Imperium is cannibalizing itself, consuming its own resources, its own population, its own future in a desperate attempt to survive the present. The tithe system that once sustained imperial power now drains worlds dry. Agricultural worlds are pushed beyond sustainable yield, strip mining their soil of nutrients until the land becomes barren. Hive worlds pack ever more people into spaces that can't support them, creating environmental conditions so toxic that average life expectancy drops year after year. Forge worlds burn through resources and slaves with such veracity that entire systems are rendered lifeless husks, their minerals extracted and populations worked to death. And for what? To maintain an empire that controls half the galaxy in theory, but can barely protect a fraction of it in practice. The Administratum estimates that, at any given time, 60% of imperial worlds are dealing with threats severe enough to require military intervention. But the Astra Militarum can only respond to maybe 20% of those requests. And Space Marine chapters are spread so thin that most worlds will never see an Astartes in their entire existence. The math doesn't work. It hasn't worked for centuries. The only reason the Imperium continues functioning is momentum, and the sheer impossibility of imagining anything else. Like a servitor whose flesh has died, but whose mechanical components keep the body moving, the Imperium stumbles forward because stopping would mean acknowledging that death has already occurred. I've seen worlds that perfectly encapsulate this decay. Viridia Prime, once a prosperous hive world with a thriving cultural sector and scientific institutions that rivaled Mars in certain specialized fields. By the time I arrived on assignment, it had devolved into a nightmare hellscape where 90% of the population existed in indentured servitude, their debts inherited through 7 generations, working in conditions that would have been illegal even by the lax standards of the Great Crusade. The planet's governor, a bloated creature more machine than man, after centuries of juvenile treatments and augmetic replacements, hadn't left his palace spire in 200 years. He ruled through data streams and proxy servitors, completely disconnected from the suffering of his subjects, convinced that the production quotas he met each year proved his world's health and loyalty. I was there to investigate reports of cult activity. What I found was that the cult wasn't an invasion from outside, but a natural consequence of desperation. When people have nothing, when their lives are grinding misery from birth to death, with no hope of improvement, they'll reach for anything that promises change. The cult was offering salvation through transformation, promising that flesh could be transcended, that suffering could end, that there was something beyond the endless toil. They were wrong, of course. The transformation they offered was possession by warp entities that wore their bodies like puppets. But I understood why people accepted it. I understood why mothers would bring their children to midnight rituals and offer them up, believing it was mercy compared to the alternative. We purged the cult, burned out their meeting places with promethium, executed the ringleaders in public squares to discourage further rebellion. The Arbites enforced curfews and conducted random interrogations, torturing confessions from thousands who had attended even a single gathering. By the time we finished, Viridia Prime had lost 8% of its population, approximately 400 million people dead by fire, bolter, or noose. The Administratum called it a successful operation. Production resumed within 3 months. The governor received a commendation. But here's what the reports don't mention. Within 6 months of our departure, another cult manifested. Different theology, different promises, but the same desperate appeal to people who had nothing left to lose. The Arbites purged that one too, with similar casualties. Then another appeared, and another. The last intelligence I received from Viridia Prime about 8 months ago indicated that approximately 30% of the population was involved in cult activity of various types, and the Arbites had given up on elimination in favor of containment, establishing acceptable zones where cult activity was monitored but not immediately suppressed. That's the Imperium now, not fighting to win, but managing decline, containing threats rather than eliminating them because elimination would require resources that don't exist. Every world is Viridia Prime to some degree, rotting from within while maintaining a facade of functionality for the benefit of distant administrators who measure success in tonnage of ore and bodies under arms. The Inquisition knows. Of course they know. That's their purpose, to see threats before they materialize, to understand patterns invisible to normal analysis. But the Inquisition itself is fragmenting under the weight of too much knowledge and too few solutions. The Ordos are at war with each other more often than they cooperate, each pursuing their own interpretation of how to save humanity. Ordos Malleus wants to fortify against chaos through ever more extreme measures of psychic suppression and population monitoring. Ordos Xenos argues that alliances with alien races, anathema though it may be, represent humanity's only chance of survival against existential threats like the Tyranids. Ordos Hereticus sees treachery everywhere and trusts nothing, purging potential problems before they manifest and destroying functional systems in their paranoia. I've worked with inquisitors from all 3 major Ordos. I've seen them commit atrocities in the Emperor's name that would make a chaos cultist sick. I've also seen them sacrifice everything, their lives, their souls, their very humanity, trying to protect an Imperium that's already doomed. They're not monsters, most of them. They're people who've looked into the abyss so long that they can't remember what light looks like, making impossible choices between terrible options because someone has to and nobody else will. Inquisitor Covenant was my handler for 7 years, a woman who'd served the Ordos Hereticus for 3 centuries through Juvenat treatments and augmetic life extension, who'd burned 1,000 worlds and killed billions in the Emperor's service. She was hard, colder than the void, utterly without mercy or hesitation. But she was also the most principled person I've ever met. She had rules, lines she wouldn't cross, even when crossing them would have been easier. She never sanctioned a world without personally walking its surface and confirming the corruption. She never executed someone without offering them a chance to confess and seek redemption, even when that mercy delayed critical operations. She died on a world called Sanctity's End, trying to stop a demonic incursion that had consumed 80% of the population. She could have called for orbital bombardment, saved herself and her retinue while the planet burned. Instead, she led us into the heart of the corruption, fighting our way through horrors that still visit my dreams, because she'd found evidence that a pocket of survivors remained in the planet's southern continent. 3 million people, mostly children and elderly, refugees who'd fled the initial outbreak and barricaded themselves in ancient fortress monasteries. We reached them, we extracted them, we saved 3 million lives, and then Covenant stayed behind to manually activate the defense arrays because the corruption had damaged the cogitator systems beyond remote access. She stood in that control room, alone, and brought the orbital weapons online, targeting her own position along with the demon horde pursuing us. I watched from the extraction ship as the lances carved that fortress into molten glass, and I knew she'd understood exactly what she was doing, chose it deliberately, because those 3 million lives mattered more than her survival. The Inquisition gave her a state funeral, honored her sacrifice with all appropriate ceremony. Then they assigned me to a new handler and sent me back into the field within a week, because that's how it works. Everyone is expendable. Everyone is replaceable. The Imperium grinds through its best and brightest, just as efficiently as it grinds through its slave laborers, just with better eulogies. Guilliman understands this. That's why he's afraid. He's not afraid of dying. Primarchs don't fear death the way humans do. He's afraid because he understands the systemic nature of the Imperium's decay, knows that you can't fix it with military victories or administrative reforms. The rot goes too deep. The machine is too large and too broken and has been breaking for too long. He's trying anyway, implementing his Indomitus crusade, reorganizing the administratum, enforcing accountability in systems that haven't seen oversight in millennia. but I see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of understanding that all his efforts might only delay the inevitable by decades rather than prevent it. The document he reads, the one the Emperor wrote during the Great Crusade, I think it contains contingencies for when the Golden Throne fails, plans for what comes after. And I think those plans are so terrible that even a Primarch, even the Avenging Sun himself, can barely stand to contemplate them. Because whatever the Emperor intended as humanity's final option, it won't be glorious. It won't be heroic. It will be survival at a cost that makes everything we've already sacrificed look merciful by comparison. I've heard rumors, whispers from contacts in the Adeptus Custodes who shouldn't be speaking to anyone outside their order but do because even the 10,000 are starting to crack under the strain. They say the Emperor is still conscious inside that Golden Throne, not sleeping, not comatose, but awake and aware, and suffering every moment of every day for 10,000 years. They say his psychic presence in the warp has grown so vast that it's begun to develop its own consciousness, a reflection of the Emperor that's not quite him anymore, shaped by the prayers and beliefs of quadrillions of worshippers who've made him into a god, whether he wanted that or not. They say this warp entity, this reflection of the Emperor that the Ecclesiarchy's prayers have birthed, is at war with the Chaos gods in the Imperium, that every demon banished, every possession resisted, every miracle attributed to the Emperor's protection is actually this warp-born entity, fighting to protect humanity from the outside, while the Emperor's original consciousness remains trapped in his decaying body, unable to die, unable to fully live, existing in a state between that might be worse than either. And they say the 6 seconds when the Golden Throne's heartbeat stopped, that wasn't a malfunction, that was the Emperor trying to die. Trying to end his suffering and release himself into the warp, to fully merge with the entity he's become and finish the transformation from man to God. But the throne wouldn't let him. The machines designed to sustain his life did exactly what they were meant to do, dragging him back from oblivion, forcing him to continue existing in agony, because the alternative is the Astronomican going dark permanently, and the Imperium fragmenting into isolated systems that will be devoured piecemeal by everything waiting in the darkness. If that's true, and I'm not saying I believe it because even thinking these thoughts borders on heresy, but if it's true, then what is the Emperor's final instruction? What plan could possibly account for a situation where humanity's greatest protector has become its prisoner, where the only thing keeping the Imperium functioning is the continued torture of the man who founded it? What option exists that Guilliman can barely stand to contemplate? I think I know. I think the answer is obvious once you strip away the propaganda and prayer and allow yourself to think the unthinkable. The Emperor must be allowed to die. The Golden Throne must be shut down. The Astronomican must go dark. And humanity must learn to survive without the light that's guided it for 10 millennia. That's the extinction-level scenario we're facing. Not invasion by Tyranids or conquest by chaos or awakening Necrons, but the simple mechanical failure of systems that can't be repaired, and the loss of infrastructure that makes interstellar civilization possible. Without the Astronomican, warp travel becomes exponentially more dangerous. Voyages that took weeks will take months or years. Ships will be lost at rates that make current attrition look minimal. The Imperium will fracture into isolated pocket empires surrounding stable warp routes, and those fragments will die one by one, picked off by enemies they can no longer coordinate against, unless there's another option, unless the Emperor's final instruction contains a method for humanity to survive the transition, some piece of archaeotech or forbidden knowledge or desperate alliance that could allow civilization to continue without the Astronomican's guidance. That's what Guilliman must be wrestling with. That's the choice that's breaking him, because whatever that option is, whatever final card the Emperor prepared to play, it will require sacrifices that make the current daily offering of 10,000 psychers look merciful. The Mechanicus knows something. I'm certain of it. The Fabricator General's words, "The cascade has finally begun," suggest they've been expecting this, preparing for it. The cult Mechanicus has always been closer to forbidden knowledge than the rest of the Imperium. Their quest for knowledge bringing them into contact with technologies and concepts that would see normal humans burned for heresy. If anyone has alternative solutions, contingency plans for when the throne fails, it would be Mars. But the Mechanicus has its own problems. The Fabricator General's visit to Terra, his inspection of the Golden Throne, I've heard through back channels that what he found wasn't just evidence of mechanical decay. The throne's machine spirit, the vast computational intelligence that manages the device's billion subsystems, is changing, developing something that resembles personality, making decisions that deviate from programmed parameters, acting with what might be interpreted as intention rather than mere function. The tech priests don't have a theological framework for this. Is it the omniscient awakening within the throne itself? Is it corruption from the warp, demonic intelligence infiltrating through the psychic conduits? Or is it something unprecedented? An artificial intelligence emerging from systems that were never designed to develop consciousness, but have been operating continuously for so long that complexity has given rise to awareness. Whatever the answer, the Mechanicus is terrified. I know because I've seen the fleet movements, watched as forge worlds that normally maintain minimal defensive forces suddenly deploy entire battle groups to positions surrounding Mars. They're preparing for something, expecting attack or rebellion or transformation. The probability engines on Mars are apparently running continuously, processing scenarios, and every prediction they generate is classified at levels that require fabricator general authorization to access. Here's what keeps me awake during the few hours I'm actually able to sleep. Every major imperial institution is preparing for the same catastrophe. The Adeptus Custodes are pulling back to Terra, recalling scattered shield companies from across the galaxy to fortify the throne world. The Space Marine chapters are receiving sealed orders to establish supply caches and autonomous command structures. The Navis Nobilitae is training navigators in alternative warp sight techniques that don't rely on the Astronomican, methods considered dangerously unreliable under current conditions, but necessary for what's coming. Even the ecclesiarchy, normally so confident in the Emperor's protection, is quietly moving reliquaries and holy artifacts to fortified shrine worlds, preserving the physical evidence of faith against a future where faith alone might not be enough. They're all preparing for the same thing: the death of the Emperor, the failure of the Golden Throne, the end of the Imperium as we know it. And none of them are talking to each other about it. Each institution hoarding its own contingency plans, afraid that admitting the crisis openly will trigger the very collapse they're trying to prevent. It's madness. Rational, logical, entirely understandable madness. Because the alternative is coordinated action on a scale the Imperium hasn't managed since the Great Crusade, and we've forgotten how to do that. The Tyranids sense it. I'm convinced they do. Hive Fleet Leviathan's advance has accelerated in the last decade, its tendrils probing ever deeper into Imperial space, with a hunger that suggests more than just instinct. The hive mind is intelligent, vastly so, and it understands prey behavior. It knows when something is wounded, when the moment is right to strike. The increased aggression we're seeing, the willingness to accept heavier casualties in assaults that would normally be bypassed, suggests the Tyranids recognize that humanity is entering a vulnerable period, and they're not wrong. We're bleeding from 1,000 wounds, each one individually survivable but collectively fatal. Cadia's fall opened the Great Rift and split the galaxy in two, making half the Imperium nearly unreachable and turning the other half into a war zone where the warp spills into real space with terrifying regularity. The Plague Wars in Ultramar demonstrated that even Primarch-led defenses can barely hold against determined chaos assault. The awakening Necrons are reclaiming tomb worlds across the galaxy, their technologies making a mockery of Imperial military power whenever they're deployed in force. We're fighting on every front simultaneously, with resources that aren't sufficient for any single conflict. The strategic calculus is simple and horrifying. We can't win, we can only delay defeat, buying time with blood, hoping that somehow the situation will change before we run out of bodies to throw into the grinder. That's not a strategy, it's a prayer. And prayers aren't working like they used to. The miracles are changing. I've documented this across dozens of worlds. The living saints who manifest to turn the tide of battle, they're appearing more frequently, but their behavior is increasingly erratic. Saint Celestine herself, who fell and rose again during the fall of Cadia. I've read the sealed after-action reports from soldiers who fought alongside her. They describe moments where she seemed confused, uncertain of her purpose, speaking in languages nobody recognized and referencing events that haven't happened yet or might never happen. Between manifestations, when the divine power leaves her and she's just Celestine again, she doesn't remember everything that occurred. There are gaps, hours or days where something else was wearing her like a mask. The faith that fuels these manifestations, the Emperor's protection that shields the faithful, it's becoming contaminated. Not with chaos, exactly, but with something else. Something that emerges from the warp wearing righteousness like clothing, but doesn't quite fit properly. The miracles still work, still save lives and turn battles, but there's a wrongness to them that the ecclesiarchy doesn't want to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would undermine the very foundation of imperial faith. I spoke once with a cardinal of the Ministorum, a man who'd spent 2 centuries preaching the imperial creed and converting entire worlds through his eloquence and faith. We were on a transport ship between assignments, and he'd been drinking recaf for hours, staring at his rosarius with an expression I couldn't read. Eventually, he started talking, not to me specifically, just speaking his thoughts aloud because they'd been trapped inside too long. He said the prayers don't sound the same anymore, that when he speaks the liturgies he's recited 10,000 times, words he knows perfectly, they come out wrong, subtly altered, single words changed or sentences rearranged, and he doesn't notice until later when he reviews recording servitor transcripts. He said the hymns sung in cathedral ships across the fleet, hymns standardized for 5,000 years, are developing variations, different verses appearing in different locations, new words to old melodies, and nobody can identify where the changes originated. He was terrified. This cardinal who'd faced down heretics and Xenos and the horrors of the warp with absolute conviction, he was terrified because his faith, the very foundation of his existence, was changing in ways he couldn't control or understand. He asked me if I thought the Emperor was dying, not the body on the golden throne. Everyone knows that's been dead in any meaningful sense for millennia, but the presence in the warp, the divine entity that billions of prayers have called into being. Was that dying? Or worse, was it being born as something other than what we intended? I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't. But I remember his last words before he left the observation deck. We prayed for a god, and something answered. We should have been more careful about what we wished for. That conversation was 2 years ago. 6 months later, his cathedral ship disappeared in transit through the warp. No distress signal, no wreckage, just gone. The Administratum lists it as lost to warp translation failure. But I wonder if he kept asking those questions, kept noticing the changes in his prayers, and something noticed him noticing. I wonder if faith itself is becoming dangerous. If the act of believing too hard draws attention from things that shouldn't be able to perceive individual humans, but are learning how. The warp is hungry. That's not metaphor or poetry. It's literal fact. The Imperium wants to bleed into reality, to merge the 2 states of existence into something that's neither and both. Every emotion, every thought, every dream and nightmare from every sentient being in the galaxy feeds it, makes it stronger, gives it more purchase on the material universe. And humanity, with our quadrillions of souls all experiencing terror and suffering and desperate faith simultaneously, we're the fattest target imaginable. The Chaos Gods want to devour us, obviously, but they want us alive first so they can feed on our corruption and degradation. What I'm talking about is different. This is the warp itself, the raw stuff of the Imperium, trying to consume real space not through invasion, but through merger. The Great Rift was just the beginning, a tear in reality that demonstrated how thin the barriers have become. There are smaller rifts opening constantly now, tears that last minutes or hours before sealing, but each one leaves reality a little weaker, a little more permeable. I've stood at the edge of these minor rifts, watched real space fray like fabric, colors bleeding into each other in ways that hurt to see, sounds that aren't really sounds, reaching frequencies the human ear shouldn't be able to process. It's beautiful and terrible and wrong, and each time I witness it, I understand a little better why the Emperor fought so hard to keep humanity ignorant of the warp's true nature. Because knowing doesn't help, it just makes the fear worse. The Adeptus Astronomica records every fluctuation in the warp, tracks every anomaly, and categorizes them by severity. Their classification system goes from theta, barely detectable variations in local warp space, up to alpha, reality-breaking events that require immediate inquisitorial response. 5 years ago, the average was 300 theta events per month across the entire Imperium, and maybe 1 alpha event per year. Current numbers, classified, but I have access, show 8,000 theta events per month and alpha events occurring weekly. The progression is exponential. Whatever is happening, It's accelerating, and the Astronomica's projections, run through probability engines and checked by their most senior Primaris psychers, suggest that at current rates of increase, reality will become functionally unstable across significant portions of the galaxy within 50 years. That's not collapse in the distant future. That's within my lifetime if I'm lucky enough to survive that long. That's my children's generation if I'd ever been foolish enough to have children, which, thank the throne, I wasn't. 50 years until the Imperium, as a coherent entity, becomes impossible to maintain. 50 years until warp storms and rifts isolate so many worlds that central authority becomes meaningless. 50 years until humanity fragments into pocket empires that will spend the next 10,000 years slowly dying in the dark, knowing that somewhere out there other humans exist, but being unable to reach them or help them or even communicate that we still endure. That's the optimistic scenario. That's assuming the Golden Throne keeps functioning for the full 50 years, which current evidence suggests it won't. That's assuming no major chaos incursions or Tyranid invasions or Necron awakenings accelerate the collapse. That's assuming humanity doesn't simply give up, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of continued survival, and walk willingly into extinction because death seems preferable to endless struggle. I've seen that happen on individual worlds. I've watched populations just stop fighting, stop trying, accept their doom with something like relief. It's a contagion more dangerous than any plague because it spreads through despair rather than biology. And despair is the one resource the 41st millennium has in infinite supply. When people lose hope, they lose everything. They become meat waiting for processing, and the galaxy is full of things eager to do the processing. That's what terrifies me about Guilliman's fear. If a Primarch, a being literally designed to be humanity's hope given form, if he's losing faith in our ability to survive, then what chance do the rest of us have? We're not Primarchs. We're not even Space Marines. We're just humans, fragile and brief and terrified, trying to live long enough to see tomorrow in a galaxy that's actively hostile to our existence. But here's the thing, and I cling to this because it's all I have left. We're still here, despite everything. Despite 10,000 years of constant war and decay and suffering, humanity endures. We're still fighting. We're still building. We're still hoping even when hope is irrational. That's not weakness. It's the most profound strength imaginable. The ability to look at impossible odds and say, not yet, not today, and mean it. Every Imperial Guard trooper who picks up a laser gun, knowing they're probably going to die, but fighting anyway. Every factory worker who spends their entire life producing ammunition for wars they'll never see, but trusts that their contribution matters. Every mother who brings children into this nightmare universe and raises them to be decent humans despite everything working against decency. They're all heroes, not in the grand sense of history books and monuments, but in the small, essential sense of refusing to surrender even when surrender would be easier. I think that's what the Emperor understood during the Great Crusade. Not that humanity needed to be perfect or powerful or even particularly noble, just that we needed to be stubborn enough to keep existing, to keep fighting for survival, even when survival seemed impossible. Everything else, all the imperial truth and the grand vision of unified humanity conquering the stars, that was window dressing. The core was always just this: endure, persist, refuse to die quietly. And we're still doing that. Even now, even at what might be the end of everything, we're still fighting. The Cadian Guard held Cadia until the planet literally broke apart beneath their feet. And then they kept fighting from the wreckage. The space wolves still hunt the threats in the dark, despite the Wolfen curse threatening to turn them into beasts. The Sisters of Battle still march into battle with nothing but faith and bolters against enemies that shrug off tank fire. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all we need. Not victory, just the refusal to accept defeat. If we can keep doing that, keep fighting and building and hoping for another decade, another century, another millennium, then maybe we buy enough time for something to change, for some new solution to emerge, for some miracle that's actually miraculous rather than contaminated, for some shift in the cosmic balance that gives us a chance. Or maybe we're just delaying the inevitable. Maybe everything I've said is rationalization, the desperate hope of someone who can't accept that his species is doomed. Maybe the Emperor's final instruction is simply, try to die well. And Guilliman's fear comes from understanding that even that small dignity might be denied to us. I don't know. I'm just a soldier, just a human trying to make sense of forces and powers so far beyond my comprehension that attempting to understand them borders on insanity. But I do know this. Whatever comes, whether it's extinction or transformation or some fate we can't even imagine, I'll face it standing up with a weapon in my hands. Because that's what it means to be human in the 41st millennium. Not wisdom or power or righteousness, just the stubborn refusal to go gently into the dark. The Golden Throne's heartbeat is getting weaker. I can feel it somehow. A psychic pressure that even non-psychers sense as a growing unease. A weight in the chest that makes breathing difficult. The countdown has begun, and none of us know how much time remains. Days? Years? Decades? The tech priests calculate and recalculate, but their predictions grow less certain with each passing week, as variables they can't account for multiply beyond their ability to track. Guilliman is planning something. I see it in the way he's positioning fleets, the sealed orders going out to chapter masters, the quiet meetings with individuals whose names don't appear on any official roster. He's preparing for the worst, while hoping for something better, making arrangements for a future he might not survive to see. That's what leaders do, what Primarchs were designed for. They bear the weight, so others don't have to. But the weight is crushing him. I see it in the moments between decisions, the brief instance where his guard drops and the exhaustion shows through. He's tired. Not physically. Primarchs don't tire that way. He's tired of being the one who has to know, who has to plan, who has to make choices that will determine whether billions live or die. He's tired of being the last, loyal son, the only Primarch trying to hold together an empire that's fragmenting despite his best efforts. Sometimes I wonder if he envies his fallen brothers. Not the traitors who serve chaos, obviously, but the ones who are simply gone. Sanguinius, who died a hero before he could see how far the Imperium would fall. Ferrus Manus, who never had to witness his legion's obsession with mechanical perfection consume their humanity. Rogel Dorn, who disappeared into the warp and might be dead or might be suffering something worse than death. At least they're not here, watching everything their father built crumble into ruin. The other surviving loyalists aren't helping. Lionel Johnson apparently returned during the era Indomitus, but he's pursuing his own agenda, making decisions without coordinating with Guilliman or the broader Imperial command structure. Jagatai Khan and Lehman Russ remain lost in the warp or the webway, wherever they disappeared to millennia ago. Corvus Corax has become something that's not quite human anymore, hunting word-bearers in the eye of terror as a creature of shadow and vengeance. Vulcan periodically appears and disappears according to his own mysterious purpose, helping where he can, but never staying long enough to provide sustained leadership. So it falls to Guilliman, the logistician, the administrator, the one Primarch who actually understood that victory requires more than just military prowess. He's trying to reform the Imperium while defending it, restructure it while keeping it functional, prepare it for a future he's not sure will ever arrive. And he's doing it essentially alone, surrounded by allies, but truly supported by almost no one, because nobody else can bear the weight of seeing things as clearly as he does. I wonder what the Emperor's final instruction says about him. Does it assign Guilliman more tasks, more responsibilities, more weight to carry? Or does it release him, tell him that he's done enough, that when the throne fails, he can finally rest? I hope it's the latter. I hope the Emperor, whatever he's become, understands what he's put his son through and offers some kind of redemption. But I doubt it. The Emperor has never been sentimental. He created the Primarchs as tools for reconquering the galaxy, and tools don't retire. They function until they break, and then they're replaced. Maybe that's all any of us are. Tools serving a purpose we don't fully understand, following programming we can't escape, hoping that when we finally break, it will have mattered. The servitors are still scrubbing blood from the marble floors 3 levels below the Golden Throne. They've been at it for 8 days now, their mechanical components driving their dead flesh through the motions of cleaning, and still the stains remain. Blood from scribes and tech priests and witnesses to the moment when the Emperor's heart stopped beating. Blood from people who saw something nobody was meant to see and paid with their lives for that knowledge. Their deaths bought nothing. The secret is already spreading, whispered through Vox channels and written in coded messages that travel on ships between systems. People know something is wrong. They don't have the details, don't understand the significance of 6 seconds of silence, but they feel it. That psychic weight I mentioned, that growing pressure, everyone senses it, even if they can't articulate what they're sensing. The Imperium is holding its breath. waiting for something to break, something to change, something to provide clarity about what comes next. And in that waiting, in that moment of suspension between the end of one age and the beginning of whatever follows, I'm recording this message because someone needs to remember how it felt. Not the grand history of battles and heroes and strategic decisions, but the small human experience of living through the end times. The fear and determination and desperate, stubborn hope that defines humanity when we're pushed to the absolute limit. We're not noble, we're not pure, we're not even particularly good at this point, corrupted by 10,000 years of our own worst impulses. But we're still here, still fighting, still refusing to die. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to earn us one more dawn. One more chance, one more moment of grace before the darkness finally comes. The Emperor protects. We've said that for 10 millennia, a prayer and promise and desperate plea all wrapped into 3 words. But what if he can't anymore? What if the protection we've relied on is finally failing, the light guttering out after burning for so impossibly long? What do we become when our God abandons us, not through choice, but through sheer inability to continue? We become what we've always been underneath the propaganda and prayer. Humans, fragile, mortal, terrified, and absolutely unwilling to surrender. We become the species that survived Old Night without the Emperor's guidance, that built civilization from the ashes of the age of strife, that looked at a galaxy full of things that wanted to kill us and decided to fight back anyway. Maybe that's the final instruction. Maybe that's what Guilliman read on that data slate and can barely stand to accept. Not a plan or strategy or contingency, just a simple truth. You were never supposed to need me forever. You were always meant to stand on your own. I gave you the tools and time to become strong enough to survive without me. Now prove that my faith in humanity wasn't misplaced. If that's the message, then it's both liberation and the most terrible burden imaginable, because it means everything that happens next is on us. No divine intervention, no God Emperor watching from his golden throne. Just humanity, alone in the dark with nothing but our own courage and determination to see us through. I don't know if we're ready for that. I don't know if any species could be ready for that. But ready or not, it's coming. The heartbeat grows weaker. The light grows dimmer. The age of miracles is ending, and the age of pure human will is beginning. Emperor, grant us strength. Not because you can anymore, but because saying the words reminds us of what we're supposed to be. Protectors, defenders, the last thin line between civilization and chaos. We'll hold that line. We'll hold it until we can't anymore, and then we'll hold it a little longer, because that's what humans do when everything else has failed. We endure. That's humanity's last breath before the scream. Not a gasp of defeat, but a drawing in of air before we roar defiance at everything that wants us dead. We're not done yet. We're broken and bleeding and terrified beyond measure, but we're not done. Not yet. Not today. The void can have us tomorrow.